Right, and that's where we're taking you right now to Japan, Peter.
Thanks, Palesa. Yeah, Japan is hosting its Tokyo International Conference on African Development, TICAD, this week. And straight from the G7 summit in France, President Cyril Ramaphosa joins a number of other African leaders, where Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has said that he wants the gathering to help launch impactful Japanese action on the continent. Well, joining us on the line now to discuss this is Dr. Martyn Davies, who's the Managing Director of Emerging Markets and Africa at Deloitte. He joins us now from Tokyo. Thanks so much indeed for joining us on the line. Just how important is this gathering of African leaders with their counterparts, I guess, in in Japan?
Yeah, hi, good evening. Well, good evening from Tokyo and good afternoon in South Africa, Peter. This is the 7th iteration of so-called TICAD, the Tokyo International Conference on African Development. 7th iteration, a big Japan-Africa conference held every 3 years. It's a triennial. This time around, it's in Yokohama, which is about an hour's train ride here from Tokyo. Last time it was in Nairobi, but significant. There'll be a significant large number, including our own head of state, President Ramaphosa, of course, but maybe 40 plus, I'm told. Heads of state from Africa are attending, many ministers in tow, and it's really sort of setting the tone, setting the agenda for Japan's engagement of the continent for the next 3 years or so. Of course, the undercurrent of the conversations is always China. And I actually met some Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs officials earlier here today. But it's predominantly Japan-Africa. It's about aid, it's about infrastructure, and also predominantly it's around automotive, which is one of the key sort of sectors that Japanese corporates are focused on in our part of the world.
You mentioned China. I mean, when we look at South Africa and Japan, for as long as I can remember, Japan really has been quite dominant. When we think about the automotive industry in particular, Japan's hand is everywhere. Has China taken over time, and is this part of why Japan, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe talks about impactful Japanese action on the continent?
There's a sense that, I think, as I said, there's a sense that they need to compete with China for both the geopolitical and geoeconomic space, if you will. Trade is relatively low at $9 billion, where China and Africa trade is roughly 200. So, again, China has more, levers to pull at its disposal. A lot more sort of state-directed finance for its policy banks, political lending into the continent. Japan's sort of casting itself as a fair weather partner, one with lending practices arguably that are more sustainable, companies that invest in true sort of industry, automotive being case in point, industrial sort of clusters, and not a fair weather friend, but a long-term partner for not just business, but for development and the aid provision as well. So the contrasts are natural. There's of course a competition going on here. The challenges for how African countries leverage this for increased capital inflows, and ultimately perhaps not just about investment in terms of capital, but in financial terms. But how do you get intellectual capital from most importantly, arguably, from the likes of Japanese corporates and embed them into our own domestic economies and ecosystems? We've done that of automotive. What other sectors should we start thinking about?
So steel is another big thing. Japan imports in its numbers and developed its own massive steel industry. What else can the continent offer Japan that makes this relationship useful?
I think the sort of a macro here, in South Africa particularly, and I met with Abraham Patel, Minister of Trade and Industry, earlier this evening. He was giving a briefing to a handful of us South African corporates and South African business people in the room. And the key sort of one of the things is let's not lose sight of the macro here. We're seeing disruption of global value chains, courtesy or as a direct cause of Donald Trump, U.S. Republican actions against China, disruption of value chains out of China into Southeast Asia, particularly into the likes of Vietnam, including Japanese companies who require market access and, above all, certainty into developed, particularly U.S. economy, and ultimately how does African countries, particularly South Africa, start to become arguably, in inverted commas, the Vietnams of Africa, attracting low to medium, very employment generative, high job creating investment from industry out of China into our own economies. And I think that's something which Japan has been very pervasively present in China and Southeast Asia for decades now, and a lot of these value chains have been disrupted. How do we start to attract that, arguably even to our own special economic zones, which are starting to gain some traction?
What does President Ramaphosa say to Japan and Japanese business people?
Well, we're seeing we have a business forum tomorrow, quite very well attended, in fact, around 130, 140 business people there, mostly Japanese. President Ramaphosa is addressing a business forum along with Minister Ibrahim Patel. And Deloitte, we're the knowledge partner of the event. And one of the key messages, I think, from Ramaphosa is going to be, again, is that South Africa sees itself as a platform, springboard, if you will, into the region. But of course, we know we haven't got that, that tailwind effect of 3, 4, 5% GDP growth, which we arguably need to really start to attract this investment. So I think there'll be more talk around how do we revitalize, in light, again, the China shadow, arguably, the Japan-Africa relationship or the Japan-South Africa relationship. What are the new areas of collaboration? But often it's very difficult. And Peter, we've been talking about this question for years, looking through a lens of the Japanese, at least, saying that how do you, not just South Africa, but other countries in our region, economies, Japan's a very complex economy, economic complexity. Other countries in our region are very, very simplicity, if you will. How do you sort of marry the two interests? It's not easy, but I think there's certainly areas we can target if we are, sufficiently pragmatic about it, and like the Japanese, plan long term for this, and start to affect conducive environments to attract our capital, be it financial or intellectual, as I mentioned.
We've had these kinds of initiatives, even here in South Africa. I think if I remember, not so long ago, there was this JETRO gathering, and I just wonder what does come of these things. Is it, one doesn't want them just to be gatherings. Do they actually see things being born out of them?
Well, I think they're meant to be, and the word used earlier was enabling, or a phrase used, enabling platforms, and that's the intention, is to get the political economy right, i.e. business and government aligned. I see many South African companies sort of stating what we want in terms of market access into the Japanese economy. Think a lot of agricultural products, for example, facing non-tariff barriers. How do the political sort of bodies, personalities start to open those doors for us? I think it's very important. I think also, let's not understate this, the networking value that comes from the likes of South African and Japanese businesses, meeting for the first time in many cases and building those relationships. Our commercial relationships have most certainly tilted, or pivoted rather, toward Asia in the last generation or so. I think, however, those relationships and deeper relationships between business are yet to catch up. And I think that's certainly the case with Japan, amongst other territories, economies in this part of the world as well.
Dr. Martyn Davies, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks very much indeed. Hopefully we can catch up with you in a few days after this gathering and the forum that's taking place tomorrow, just to get a sense of what's been said and what might come out of it. That was Dr. Martyn Davies, who's the Managing Director, Emerging Markets in Africa at Deloitte, speaking to us from Tokyo.